an overview of Revelation, I want to highlight two perspectives, both of which are super helpful in understanding the book of Revelation. Firstly, Revelation can be seen in two parts as it relates to the bridegroom and the bride. Chapters 1 to 11 talk about the bridegroom, beginning in chapter 1 and ending in Revelation 10, 1 to 7, with visions of the Son of Man clothed in glory. This section reveals a victorious Jesus. Then you have chapters 12 to 22, which talk about the bride, beginning in Revelation chapter 12 and ending in Revelation 21, verses 9 to 27, with visions of the church clothed in glory. This section reveals a victorious church. So the first half of Revelation speaks to a victorious Jesus, and the second half speaks to a victorious church. Milton Terry, who's a professor of Hebrew and Old Testament exegesis and theology, who lived from 1840 to 1911, says this of Revelation and its two parts. Part 1 has revealed the Lamb of God under various symbols, glorious in power, opening the book of divine mysteries, avenging the martyred saints and exhibiting the fearful judgments destined to come upon the enemies of God. Everything is viewed as from the throne of the King of Heaven, who sends forth his armies and destroys the defiant murderers of his prophets and burn up their city. Part 2 reveals the church in conflict with infernal and worldly principalities and powers, surviving all persecution and triumphing by the word of her testimony. And after Babylon the harlot falls and passes from view, appearing as the wife of the Lamb, the tabernacle of God with men, glorious in her beauty and imperishable as the throne of God. Secondly, we can use a form of Hebrew poetry called a chiastic arch to help us understand Revelation. You see, much of the Bible in its original language was written in this form of Hebrew poetry called the chiastic arch, and Revelation is no exception. In a chiastic arch, the first parts of the arch progress together towards a central idea, and the final parts of the arch progress together back toward the original idea. Take a look at this image. The first parts of the arch, here represented by ABC, progress together towards a central idea, represented here by D. The final three parts, C1, B1, A1, progress together back towards the original idea. So a chiasm or chiasmus is a writing style that uses a unique repetitive pattern for clarification and for emphasis. Many Hebrew poems follow this cyclical arch form. This repetition form is also found in ancient literature, such as the poetry of the Odyssey and the Iliad. Various chiastic structures are also seen in both the Old and New Testaments, where the biblical writers used it to illustrate or highlight details of particular importance. The way we approach the scriptures will be dramatically enhanced as we learn what a chiasm is and how to recognise chiasms. Now, chiastic arches can vary in length, but what we get in chiasms is that the text is split in half, with the central idea being the longest and most important. So in the case of my previous example, D is the most important point. And the corresponding parts, for example, A, A1, B, B1, while not identical, are similar and often help explain each other. What you get is a repetition of a similar idea in the reverse sequence as you move away from the central point. Once we begin to understand and recognise chiastic arches, it brings added depth and meaning to passages. Thomas B. Clark explains chiastic arches this way. A chiasm organises themes much like a sandwich. A piece of bread on top, B, mustard, C, a delightful piece of meat, C1, another savoury piece of meat, B1, more mustard, and finally A1, another piece of bread on the bottom. Chiasms generally focus on the flavourful meat, he says, but the bread and mustard are necessary for a complete sandwich. Some chiasms do not have a mustard layer. Other chiasms have lettuce on both sides of the meat, and some have just one piece of delicious meat. So let's take a look at the chiastic arch present in the entire book of Revelation. What I'm going to share here about chiastic arches in Revelation comes from the teaching of Dr. Jonathan Welton. So in Revelation, he says you have 4 corresponding parts, A, B, C, and D, with a central part being E. At the beginning and end, the A's are the greeting and the epilogue. The first B is the 7 churches, and the second B, B1, is the New Jerusalem and the bride. Both of these are the church, and there's a progression that happens from the state of the 7 churches in the first B to the second B, where the bride of Christ surfaces after the marriage supper of the Lamb. The first C is the 7 seals, and the second C is the destruction of Babylon. The first D is the 7 trumpets, an angel and 2 witnesses. The second D is the 2 beasts, an angel and the 7 bowls. In the middle, in E, we find the woman, the dragon, and the male child. This central event in Revelation 12, where it talks about the woman, the dragon, and the male child, is the most important piece, the centre of the book. It's the story of the incarnation, Jesus taking on flesh, his conception and birth. Everything in the first half of the book leads toward it, and everything in the second half of the book leads from it. In Revelation 12, the woman is a picture of the remnant of Israel, the true followers of God, believing Israel, and she gives birth to a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. This child is Jesus. The red dragon, who is at war with the child and with Michael the archangel, is the accuser of the brethren, Satan. When he is defeated and cast out of heaven, he begins to fight against the woman's other children. These children who come after the firstborn Jesus are the early Christians. So in Revelation 12, we get the whole picture of the gospel and the story of the formation and finalization of the new covenant. This is central to the whole message of Revelation. If you're interested in researching the chiastic arch in Revelation further, I encourage you to check out Dr. Jonathan Welton's book, Understanding the 7 Churches of Revelation.